This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Man, that was a seamless weekend of wrestling content. It's funny, I almost forgot what it's like when the Monday shows are just the retro Raw and SmackDown reports. The last couple Monday shows have been really busy with content, especially coming out of WrestleMania weekend. Then I turned around this week and watched basically a little over 3 hours of combined wrestling from the Raw and SmackDown shows. And by the end of it, I was like, wow. I mean, the show still sucked by and large, but at least it didn't melt my brain by the end of it. Although SmackDown was really pushing my patience this week. Good God almighty. Ugh. Talk about depriving all the life and energy out of a human being. Oh, we'll get to that show. Just you wait. I have a thing or two to say about SmackDown. However, obviously if you're checking out the Five Starr Wrestling Report channel for the very first time, as I always say, whether you're watching on YouTube or Rumble, make sure you give the show a like, a follow, a comment. If you're on YouTube, you can subscribe and click the bell icon to stay posted for when all of our shows go up. Again, that is Monday and Friday for any new viewers. Or if you prefer Rumble as your regular platform to watch content, you can show similar support by going over there. And the links are always in the description box in case you choose to go back and forth between them. Things have kind of settled down in the world of wrestling lately. And for WWE, that might not be a good thing, especially with what I've seen the last couple weeks on SmackDown. And then, of course, there's Retro Raw, which is definitely Retro Raw. If you've been following the archives on the Monday show, you know what you're in for most weeks. In the case of 1994, not a whole lot. Lots of cartoon segments, lots of hokey, wacky gimmicks and storylines, and somewhere in the middle of all that hot garbage, there's Bret and Owen Hart trying to carry the load with the wrestling side of things. Sprinkle in Shawn occasionally when he was still mildly tolerable by this period in the business. But it's really not too far off from what we got going on with the modern era today. The good is few and far between, and you take the good where you can get it. So anyway, should we do Raw? I know you're all just foaming at the mouth to hear me tear into this thing. Yeah, sorry. It's one of those shows. Actually, I was thinking about something. We all know these Raws are going to get progressively worse as time goes on. And we barely cracked the surface of just how bad things are about to get in the next couple of years. I was honestly thinking about doing a countdown clock in the corner of the screen for every Retro Raw from now until I don't know, whenever we consider the first day of the Attitude Era. So basically any time from WrestleMania 14 onward. But that way I could come on here and be like, well guys, only 672 days away from us getting to the glory years. Or whatever you consider the Attitude Era. They weren't the glory years of wrestling for me, but good Lord. I'll take anything from the Attitude Era over this dumpster fire. And I probably should have picked a different word other than dumpster. especially with what was about to come later on. But holy shit, these shows are awful. And like I said, man, this is only 1994. I remember some of those old Raws from 95, even early to mid 96. Trust me when I say, we'll be longing for the 1994 Raws again by the time we get to some of those shows. And we're also still a few years out from Raw going to 2 hours. I always forget what year that was. Was it 96? Or was it a little later on than that? I mean, my timeline is still a little shaky around this period. Regardless, this one still sucked a dick. Even for 45 minutes of programming. It started off relatively good, with them replaying the angle last week where Jerry Lawler got dumped off his throne and humiliated in front of the nationwide audience. What probably will amount to be the greatest bump of Lawler's career, going face first off a giant platform and landing right on the side of the ring apron. Good thing Lawler was always a great worker, elsewise I would have thought he broke his nose. But that 30 seconds of airtime pretty much was where the show peaked. That and partially some of the opening match. Because then we cut to the building here in Utica, New York, of all places. Which you know Vince had a ball saying on commentary. As he did so for getting the chance to pronounce the name Quang over and over again. It's Quang versus Bret Hart, non-title. And every time Vince said the name Quang, literally sounded like the guy was about to hack up a hairball. Could have just called him Savio Vega working a fake Asian gimmick to save us all the trouble. I mean, I think Quang lasted shorter as a gimmick than Shane McMahon did in the ring at WrestleMania a couple weeks ago. But of course, we all know when it came to Bret. Even if I was never the biggest Bret fan growing up, we knew the work ethic of that guy when it came bell time. Didn't matter if he was wrestling Owen or fucking Bastion Booger. That guy was going to go out there and do his damnedest to pull a good match out of anybody. And they had about as good a match as you could expect. Normally during my perusal of these matches, I try to find semi-humorous material to pick up on with the commentators. Speaking of Quang being another one of Vince's failed experiments, I like during this match, Savage tried to ask Vince to provide a little more context on Quang, specifically who he was and where he was from. And during this conversation, there's like a 10-second pause before Vince finally chimes in with, "Well, I don't know where he's from." He couldn't have just said the Orient? Or was that considered politically incorrect by the mid-90s? Like, just the fact that the gimmick was so generic should tell you everything about why it failed. The other thing of note was them having Owen on the phone here to talk to Savage and Vince. And, I mean, he really didn't say all that much. Just the fact that he's on the WrestleMania Revenge Tour, and he plans on getting his deserved rematch with Bret down the road, this time getting his opportunity to wrestle for the WWF title. It was kind of funny hearing Vince cut Owen off every few seconds to count the near falls. It's like, can you let Owen do his fucking Heat promo without shouting, 1, 2, yes? It's like, shut up, dude. In any case, Quang and Bret had a very basic TV match. Bret sold for a little bit, fought back at the end, and he ended up going over clean with the sharpshooter. Harmless enough segment. I will say, too, I always liked the lighting visual they gave for Bret's segments. The whole pink lighting over the ring. That was always kind of neat. And obviously you see what they're setting up here down the road between Owen and Bret. I mean, this was one of the hottest stories coming out of WrestleMania 10. And you knew as soon as Owen went over Bret in that opening match, even if Bret somehow managed to find a way to win the belt later on. You knew they were going to end up rematching him and Owen at some point. The writing was kind of on the wall for that one. At which point we came back for a quick charity plug with Dink and Doink on an ice rink. And I honestly could not tell you if they were trying to teach the kids how to ice skate or vice versa. Either way, it's usually mildly funny watching young kids try to ice skate, watching them eat shit and fall on their faces every 2 seconds. At least I think it was funny. Then we went back to the ring for Jeff Jarrett versus PJ Walker, wherein Vince was bringing up previous angles from WWF Superstars, where Dink and Doink allegedly threw water in Double J's face. And people wonder why I always had a hard time taking Jarrett seriously as a main eventer. Trust me, it's not just a ridiculous outfit. And it was an alright heel showcase piece. It was cool seeing him break out the slingshot suplex, even though the Macho Man claimed to have never seen that move before. I mean, not that I'd be all that surprised. I highly doubt Randy Savage was watching his Tully Blanchard tapes in his spare time, but it's not like the move had never been done before. So anyway, Double J won that. What point it served, I honestly couldn't tell you, but it was definitely a thing on the show. God, watching wrestling these days, I'll take a Jeff Jarrett match on AEW Dynamite over most of the crap I see. Then we cut to a pre-tape with Captain Lou Albano, where he essentially threatened President Jack Tunney by saying that he wants a tag title shot for the Head Shrinkers on next week's Raw. Or else. So I guess Tunney's hands are tied. Whenever you got the babyface managers making open threats and demanding championship matches, all hands on deck there. It's definitely the kind of stuff you would come to expect out of babyfaces. And then we went back to the ring for a Steiner Brothers squash. They wrestled the team of Mike Curry and Barry Hardy. And jeez, oh man. You talk about guys having clear-cut boo-boo job face syndrome on camera sometimes. Well, for those that don't know, that's basically a cornyism for guys that are told, you're doing the job tonight. So they go out there begrudgingly and put over somebody when they really don't want to. Rick Steiner, I can't even necessarily say that he had boo-boo job face because, Rick and Scott won this thing very convincingly. I don't know what you would call this expression. Fuck me, this place sucks, I want to go back to Japan face. I know we're never going to get a top push in this company ever again, so fuck everything about this contract and send me home face. It was like a cross between the moop face and the I've totally checked out face. And man, how timely in the news to be referencing a Rick Steiner incident. I'm not sure how much I want to delve into details here, but I'm sure everybody's read and or heard about the WrestleCon episode. I knowingly did not chime in for personal reasons, mostly because I was looking for fallout. You know how all those stories go. Yeah, like 8 talking heads trying to present 8 different viewpoints on the same matter. And they always say the truth lies somewhere in the middle. At this point, I think we can mostly chalk it up to Rick being Rick. I didn't even know who Giselle Shaw was until I read about this story. Mostly because she's been wrestling for Impact. And, well, it's Impact. No one gives a fuck. Regardless, it's just another textbook example of what happens when you let the woke culture inhabit the sport of professional wrestling with all the corporate inclusivity nonsense. You probably noticed on this channel, I've kept my conversations about Nyla Rose very surface level. Again, there's a reason for that. I'm not justifying or saying what Rick did was right. Probably could have handled the situation better. But I've also seen plenty of people comment on that story. And I don't think my opinion is the anomaly here. I think there are a lot of people that fall into my camp when it comes to what we think about what's being tolerated now in the cultural war. And if you want a clear-cut example of that, I'll give you 2 words. Bud Light. You can do your own research from there. But getting back to Raw here, this was your quintessential Steiner Brothers smash with about 50% of the effort and attitude. Rick and Scott picked these dudes up and threw them around for a while. Meanwhile, Vince was bringing up the idea on commentary of what it would be like if Rick and Scott were ever to split up and feud. To which I said, well, just check out WCW in a few years when they tried it. It fucking sunk like the Titanic because nobody wanted to see it. Anyway, this was probably the most lifeless Steiner Brothers match I probably ever saw right up until the last minute, where Scotty just fired up from out of nowhere, only to then kill one of the job guys with a Steiner screwdriver and then pin him. At which point they immediately cut to what will evidently go down as one of the top 10 worst WWF gimmicks of all time. And think about the ground that fucking covers. And I've kind of been dreading talking about this ever since I saw the show. But I guess we got to bring it up at some point, right? Y'all remember Duke the Dumpster Droese? Because I sure didn't. I totally forgot about this horrible gimmick until they mentioned it again. Much like how a lot of bad gimmicks escape my memory for a period of time. Although Sparky Plug, that will forever be ingrained in my memory. Let us also not forget Isaac Yankem. That one's coming up in a year or two. But I forgot all about good old Duke Droese, the garbage man. And holy shit, this promo package. This promo package. Oh, God. Well, it was horrible. It was like 20 seconds long, if that. But it was easily one of the worst 20 seconds of Raw programming I've seen thus far. We see a garbage truck come barreling down a back street, and off the side of the truck jumps Duke the Dumpster Droese, is introduced here. Graphics and everything. I did comment as a side note here. Why was there a WWF cameraman filming a garbage truck coming down a back street? Couldn't tell you. And his quote, not making this shit up, swear to God, I wrote this down almost verbatim. He goes, I'm Duke the Dumpster Droese, and I don't take garbage from anyone. Well, yeah, I do. But I don't have to if I don't want to. At which point he tosses a few garbage bags into the trash compactor. The truck proceeded to drive off. And that was it. That was how they introduced Duke the Dumpster Droese to the WWF. So what do we got now? NASCAR drivers, clowns, fat gluttons, fake dentists, and now garbage men. This was Vince McMahon's vision of professional wrestling. Or, I'm sorry, sports entertainment-based wrestling. And to think I actually put up with this shit growing up. Who'd have thunk it? And if you thought that was bad, check out this featured segment for the show. a King's Court segment with special guest Alundra Blaze. Yeah. Because you all remember those riveting promo segments with Alundra Blaze that tore the house down. The time she went out there and stole the show with her incredible promo ability. Oh, wait a minute. That never happened. And, well, kind of like how the King's Court segment with Lex Luger didn't really serve much of a purpose by the end of it, this one was also more or less pointless by the end of it. Because in a segment that I thought was intended to be designed to get over Alundra Blaze, the only thing that it ended up getting over by the end was the teasing of Roddy Piper versus Jerry Lawler, which was a match that they blew off at the King of the Ring tournament in about a month. Not even a Big Four show. The King of the Ring pay-per-view. And after some rather cringe back-and-forth dialogue between Alundra and Lawler that died a death, here comes Luna Vachon to confront Alundra for more promo material that died an even grosser death. And, albeit I had no idea what the hell was going on here, aside from Alundra losing her train of thought and just kind of flatlining mid-promo, I think they were trying to get over here that Luna stole the WWF women's belt or something. It's kind of hard to tell since we never see the girls wrestle on Raw, so it's impossible to tell what's been going on with the women's division. Kind of like watching AEW where you never know what's going on half the time because half the shit happens on Rampage and no one watches that shit. So this is horrible. Poor Lawler couldn't even save this atrocity by the end. And again, I should remind you all, in their efforts to try and build up a women's title program on the show, keep in mind where that belt winds up landing in about a year and a half. Just so we're all on the same page. That was followed with Earthquake beating Mike Bell, the highlight of which was watching Mike Bell attempt to do a Greco-Roman knuckle lock with Earthquake from the middle rope, because Earthquake kept fucking with him and stood on his toes when Bell couldn't reach him at foot level. Beyond that, Earthquake beat the guy up and eventually won with the running seated splash. At which point they immediately cut to the pre-tape of showing what went down on the WWF Superstars show with Quang, Tatanka, and Erwin R. Shyster. No. I mean, Quang was sort of a non-factor by the end of this. He just so happened to be wrestling Tatanka when all this went down. But just to bring some context back into the picture, do you all remember that bizarre segment a few weeks back where Chief Jay Strongbow and Wahoo McDaniel came out there to present Tatanka with that prestigious Native American headdress? And IRS got all bent out of shape about it because Tatanka did not pay taxes on it? Well, guess what IRS did? Tatanka ends up getting misted in the face by Quang, and then IRS grabs the headpiece from ringside. He starts mocking Tatanka with it while he's tangled up in the ropes, and then he proceeds to start ripping apart the feathers. And then Strongbow tried to come down to stop him, and he ended up getting his ass kicked. And, yeah. That was a storyline they crafted out of this. IRS and Tatanka fighting over a fake headpiece gimmick. Because that was a thing that people would certainly care about. But hey, to be fair, we've certainly seen guys fight over dumber shit in the business. See every bad stipulation match that Russo ever booked on Nitro in the late 90s. But that's a conversation you can read about in The Death of WCW. A book that is not a rib. Just Brian Alvarez recounting shit that actually happened in wrestling in the late 90s that forever exposed the business. And all that kind of tied in with the main event It is IRS versus, I think I got this name right, Melvin Gates. Probably the only time in the history of wrestling where you ever hear a guy with the name Melvin. And there's probably a reason for that. Like, there are just certain names out there that doom guys from day one. Anybody in wrestling that decides to go by the name Melvin, Godspeed on your career, home dog. So, well, the match was rather uninspiring. I think I still prefer this version of Mike Rotunda over the bland, boring babyface version of him we're currently reviewing in Crockett Promotions in '87. Although they're pretty neck and neck, because I was never the biggest IRS fan in the world. Both the character and the governmental body. But Irwin won that match in relatively short order. Not much more to say about that. And then for our closing angle of the show, we get a pre-taped interview with Johnny Polo talking with Savage and Vic. I still love the inside rib with Polo calling Vince Vic every week. Anyway, well, his point was to talk about how he's not concerned that the Quebecers may have to face the Head Shrinkers next week, now that Captain Lou Albano is basically holding Jack Tunney at gunpoint to try and book the match. But Johnny's very confident that his boys will be fine, even though you can actively see the guy shitting peach seeds on camera. He's such an underrated Weasley manager, that Johnny Polo was. Like, we all talk about how much he excelled as the Raven character in latter years, but man, Johnny Polo was way too short-lived a gimmick. Like, he was a really good underneath heel manager for a period in his career. I wish they would have rode that wave of momentum longer, because they could have gotten so much more mileage out of him. But that's kind of how the show ended this week. And like I said at the top, the last 20 or so minutes in particular were a real chore to sit through here. Like, even with the Steiners wrestling this week, like Jared going out there and having a short match, fucking Bret in the opener on the card, it was still a nothing happening episode of Raw. Just one of those things, man. You look around during this period and you see a few stars lingering about here and there, but the bad gimmicks and the cartoon presentation really outweighs a lot of the good stuff. And we're knee-deep into it, man. We've still got a couple years before things totally go off the rails. Plus, there's the whole Bret-Shawn drama to cover, and a lot of that's going to warrant its own separate discussion. I might just have to dedicate an entire third podcast to covering the Bret-Shawn saga, because I don't think I have enough time to cover all that in the Retro Raw reviews. The only thing I could say about this show was, thank God for Jerry Lawler. Because even though that interview segment with Luna and Alundra was the shits, the King tried to make it work. Trying to carry and walk Alundra through a talk segment. I hope they paid him extra for that, because he earned it. Also having to listen to Luna gargle and shriek in his ear from like 3 inches away. That also had to have sucked. But at least we can say this. There was more star power on this show than there was on SmackDown. All right, pal. Speak of the devil. Let us check out what horrors awaited us on this week's installment of the Blue Brand. Could not have been much worse than whatever in the hell they dished out last week. God, that show sucked. But honestly, I can't even say this one was bad. But it sure did a fine job boring the fucking brakes off me. That's for sure. Y'all know how I constantly come on here and talk about how Dynamite is usually a bad wrestling show, but I never say it's boring. man, now that we're post-WrestleMania and things have started to cool down a little bit here, especially with a lot of those top main event programs, this show nearly put me to sleep. I barely got through that first segment without nodding off about midway through. If their goal was to put together the most sleep-inducing, comatose program they possibly could, mission accomplished, boys. Because I could argue they ought to be recommending this show to doctors that are looking for proper cures to insomnia. But we'll try to muscle way through this thing and make it somewhat entertaining. Because Lord knows WWE's trying to make shit entertaining anymore. Apologies in advance if I fail in doing so. But we kick things off with Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn, the current reigning undisputed tag team champions of both Raw and SmackDown. Keep that in mind for the brand split. Trying to get people stoked about the upcoming draft in like 2 or 3 weeks. And meanwhile, who are the first two people we see on the show? Two champions that are representing both brands. Which basically means that by the time the draft comes, it's pretty apparent that neither of these guys are going to be brand exclusive, so why do we care about the brand split? Well, your guess is still as good as mine. But they're out there trying to do the babyface promo. The crowd was oddly quiet and tame. I mean, granted, they were in fucking Nebraska of all places. I mean, the entire population consisted of pretty much everybody in that building. I mean, Nebraskans don't really have a reputation for being the most boisterous bunch either. But it didn't take long for Owens to mention that the Usos are going to be on the prowl for a title rematch before, who should interrupt but the Usos. And they're doing the back and forth exchange with Sami and KO. Sam is talking about how the Usos can pretend that everything's all sunshine and rainbows in the bloodline, but we all know that Roman's buying his time and waiting for the right moment to command Solo to take out Jimmy and Jay for good. And all this pretty much culminated with all five guys getting into a brawl until Matt Riddle ran down to even out the odds. And we kind of touched on this last week, how it looks like they're setting up some kind of six-man tag, probably for the Backlash special, which is kind of a mid-payoff if I'm being blunt about it. Not that I necessarily have anything against the idea of them doing the match, but when I think Sami, KO, and Riddle versus the Bloodline, I don't think premium live special. I think TV main event. Like something you would expect to see on a Raw. And while I get there were ties to Riddle getting taken out by the Bloodline months back, I don't know, shoehorning him into the Bloodline story now, does that not totally come off like a Vince idea? Is anyone else thinking this is coming off really forced and contrived? Hey, pal, where's that Riddle fella been? That guy's hilarious. Let's get him back on television so we can all get a kick out of him every week. Yeah, it's such good shit. I mean, okay. I like Riddle. I'm not opposed to having him back. But if you're going to tell me that this was how they were going to follow up after Sami and KO beat the Usos for the straps at Mania, just going right back to the well with them feuding after the fact when it's really uncalled for at this point, probably would have suggested a different direction, but that's just me. I don't really see a purpose for dragging this feud out any longer. To me, it's old. It's tiresome. We've seen these guys touch every week on the show for like the past 4 to 5 months. Is this really the only thing they can come up with for Sami and Owens now that they have the belts? Like, so much of this comes off like lazy writing. It's pin the same fucking guys against each other in the same matches, in the same spots, every god-blessed week. Just throw Riddle in there to shake things up a bit. And you all know the saying, you can dress up lipstick on a pig. It's still a goddamn pig. Yet this creative team gets paid somewhere in the ballpark of low six figures to come up with this crap, with very minimal thought process. Oh, and by the way, that whole opening exchange, all designed to set up their TV main event. Matt Riddle versus Solo Sikoa, which they pretty much booked on the fly during commercial. Because apparently Adam Pearce, the alleged general manager of SmackDown, went into the show not having booked a main event. Why? I don't know. Guess he's just lazy. Just like these creative writers that get paid six figures annually to scratch their asses. So that brought us to Xavier Woods versus LA Knight, where the entire buildup was that Xavier got mad that LA Knight broke his Xbox controller in the locker room. Because, well, apparently this is stuff that grown men are fighting over now in the world of combat sports. They're feuding over video games. More accurately, Xavier, the babyface, the guy that I'm supposed to like in this occasion, he's mad that LA Knight, the heel, broke his game controller because Xavier was the one playing video games. And LA Knight was, I don't know, perhaps doing normal adult things like training in the gym. I'm finding it quite hard to relate to Xavier in this situation because, well, I'm not a kid. I don't get pissed off when grown adult men break my game controllers because I actually have a fucking life. I mean, even Wade Bear was kind of making a mockery of the whole thing. Coming to the aid of Knight and talking about how absurd it is that Woods would get all bent out of shape that his playtime was interrupted. You know, shit that 9-year-old boys fight over in the basement. Meanwhile, I'm watching adult men fight over virtually the same thing. This is what we've come to now. Seriously. And I know you're all probably thinking to yourself, well, it's a New Day match, so clearly Tommy didn't watch this. I mean, he's been actively boycotting the New Day segments on this show. And you'd be correct in most cases. However, there's always an exception for my boy LA Knight. And I was mildly curious here. I wanted to see if they would actually be smart enough to put Knight over here and start trying to reconcile all that bad booking he's dealt with. What? Oh. I mean, the guy's been losing matches regularly for a while now, but I mean, surely by this point, they would have figured out that this guy's a megastar in the making. He's over with the people. He's starting to gain a lot of traction. He has like all the tools to be a main event player, so clearly they had to put Knight over here. Oh, I see. Yeah, they beat him again. Well, fuck that noise. And as far as Xavier being next in line to challenge Gunther for the Intercontinental title, fuck that noise too. I echo Gunther on this one. Xavier is a goof. And I don't like goofs either. And I appreciate that Gunther actually has a proper pronunciation of the word goof. And he doesn't say goof. Now we just need to hear him say roof instead of roof, and we'll be on good terms. It's roof, by the way. So I think this is the point in the show where they replayed the injury angle on Raw months back where Solo took out Riddle and sent him away into a local medical facility via restorative vehicular transportation. I heard Vince doesn't like the word ambulance either. We already know he hates the word hospital. That is abundantly clear when you listen to the commentators. Anyway, Owens and Sammy tried to pump Riddle up for the match later on. And Riddle got about as pumped as he could, per Matt Riddle standards. But he did have game face here. So that's a start. Then we had a very awkward Judgment Day promo where everybody just sort of layered into the frame after Kayla introduced them one at a time. First thing I immediately said was, Vince. It's another one of those weird things he does when it comes to production detail. Anyway, they all pretty much said nothing, just so they could then walk out to the ring for an in-ring promo and then virtually say nothing again. They replayed the Bad Bunny angle on Raw a couple weeks back where Priest chokeslammed him through the announcer's table, and then they played it again in slow motion. And somehow this set up a match between Damian Priest and Santos Escobar of the Latino World Order because, well, why not? And we talk about the same conglomeration of dudes touching every week on this show, doing the same thing with the Judgment Day and the Legado lackeys. And I got about 3 minutes into this thing before I totally spaced out and forgot virtually everything that happened. I actually got up to leave the room at one point, and when I came back, Escobar was just starting to make his comeback, and I swear to God that I was out of the room for way more than 5 minutes. So what these guys were doing prior, I have no idea, but God, it had to have been boring. In any case, I came back just in time to see all the chaos happening at ringside. There was a spot where Zelina Vega tried to give Rhea a Hurricane Rana on the floor, but didn't. And Rhea just sort of went face first into the LED board at ringside. And then Priest hit a South of Heaven chokeslam on Escobar for the 3. I wrote down, I made it 1 hour into the show, and I'm about ready to tap out. We also had a 30-second post-match angle where Priest threatened to chokeslam Escobar through the announcer's table, but was apparently thwarted by the power of Ray's theme music. This music was able to summon the ability to hold back Priest from giving Escobar the chokeslam because, pro wrestling logic for you. And after Ray dived out from the crowd onto Priest, conveniently in the same spot that Priest was lurking about at ringside, which was either incredibly lucky guessing on Ray's part to know that Priest was going to be standing right there, or maybe this was all just poorly thought through. And after Ray threw some punches to Dom momentarily, the heels all backed away, and it was a 5-on-3 advantage babyfaces. Although I guess you can count Zelina as half a person because, she couldn't whip cream with an outboard motor. She's about as visibly intimidating as a fucking gnat. So, we'll be fair. 4.5-on-3 advantage still baby faces. I have no idea where Finn Balor was during any of this. Maybe still getting the rest of his head stapled together after that ladder shot he took from Edge at the pay-per-view 2 weeks ago. But that's all I got out of this segment. I assume this is all being designed to set up Priest and Dom versus Ray and Bad Bunny for the Backlash show. And this segment was severely lacking in 25% of those combatants. So, why the Legado douchebags needed to be wedged into the middle of this thing, I have no clue. But there they were, taking up screen time and being as useless as always. But what else did we have here? Well, we found out why Solo Sikoa never speaks. It's because he can't. Well, no. I'll rescind that slightly. It's not that he can't talk. The problem is that when given the opportunity to speak, the voice does not match the look at all. I think this was the first time I ever heard this guy talk. Hopefully it's the last. They shot a deal in the back where Paul Heyman was trying to amp up Sikoa for his match. And while he's running down the family tree and talking about all the members that Riddle, Sami, and Owens disgraced earlier on, Sikoa cuts Heyman off mid-promo. And in the most soothing, low-key delivery imaginable, he says, "Tell the tribal chief, I got this." Okay, pause. You've all seen Solo Sikoa. Look at the guy. Your first inclination is to think, the voice of Damian Priest, only to then hear the voice of Morgan Freeman. And you're like, oh shit. Did not expect that. I was expecting deep voice, threatening, menacing, scary Samoan. And I think we were supposed to be concerned and or unsettled by the intonation in Sikoa's delivery. I kind of chalked it up to, it's a great voice if he's trying to get the kids to take a nap. Kind of like what I was on the verge of doing by the time we got to this point in the show. And since I was starting to nod off again, I thought to myself, there's got to be something that I can skip over and not feel guilty having missed it. Sure enough, right on cue, we get the introduction to our apparently new women's tag team champions, Liv Morgan and Raquel Ramirez Gomez Alejandro III. And that was enough for me to say, I think I'm good. Probably nothing all that noteworthy I'm going to take away from that segment. I still forgot the girls' tag belts were even a thing. No joke. You put a gun to my head and you ask me, name the previous champions prior to Raquel and Liv. I couldn't have fucking told you. Because let's be honest, who cares? The only people that care are the mouth-breathing, estrogen-dominant weirdos that still fawn over girls wrestling any chance they get. A marketed fan base that, quite frankly, I'll never understand and never relate to. But getting off that subject as quickly as humanly possible, buried in the middle of the second hour, we had the return of Shinsuke Nakamura. Where the hell he's been at, I couldn't tell you. Maybe injured. But apparently he's back now. And he's wrestling Madcap Moss. Oh. I'm desperately trying not to bury this show. With every fiber of my being, I'm trying not to bitch up a storm here. But seriously now, that was what they had planned for Nakamura's TV return? Having him go out there and beat Madcap fucking Moss with Emma, who apparently is now teasing a heel turn? Right, because I'm sure that's the exact thing that Madcap needs to launch his career in the right direction. Let's turn him heel. That'll get the people to care about him. Yeah, and I got a fucking townhouse in Florida to sell you. And I'm not even trying to poon the Nakamura return. Honestly, I kind of forgot that guy existed. I mean, he's been so poorly misused on the main roster for years now. I kind of forgot the guy was still under contract. I mean, I'm not opposed to them using him. What they're planning on doing with him is another matter entirely. For all we know, this could wind up being totally pointless in the end because we could end up seeing him getting drafted to Raw in a couple weeks and then we'll never talk about him again. But until I actually see what they do with him, I really don't have much more to say about it. I mean, Nakamura hasn't been cool in the WWE for like 6 years. The hottest he ever was during his NXT run when he first came in. And we all know what happened after he got called up to the main roster. I mean, he showed up here and I was like, oh yeah, that guy's still around, eh? Speaking of guys that are still around, Karrion Kross and Scarlett. Yep. They're still collecting a paycheck somehow. But I guess we're supposed to be worried because Kross said, "Tick-tock." And he looked at the camera and snarled. Which I guess means that he'll be returning to television soon. To do what, you ask? Probably nothing important. Probably just a job again and fade into the background like he's been doing since they brought him back. Because that financial investment was well worth it. Right, Hunter? Right? So with the brain power I had left by this point in the show, which is pretty much none, we got to the main event. Matt Riddle versus Solo Sikoa. This is also where we learned that in 2 weeks in Corpus Christi, Texas, we're going to be getting the WrestleMania rematch with Sami, KO, and the Usos for the tag belts. And when they threw up the graphic for this, the crowd reacted to it like something you would probably hear in a golf tournament. By the way, I did not mention this at the beginning of the show. This crowd fucking sucked. Hard. I think I now know why Nebraska historically has never been a great place to run wrestling. The crowds are rotten. Rotten! So anyway, the match. It was alright. Compared to everything else we saw on the show, it was like watching fucking Flair and Steamboat all over again. The thing I always talk about with Riddle, yes, the gimmick is an acquired taste. Some people like the bro stuff, some people think it's obnoxious. I've usually enjoyed a lot of Riddle segments in WWE. There are times where I'd prefer it if he dialed back on the goofiness, but generally speaking, I find his humor entertaining. Like I said, I only caught clips of the stuff he was doing with Randy Orton last year. I thought those guys actually worked very well as a duo. The whole wacky, unlikely tag partners that start off not really being on good terms, but eventually grow to tolerate and work together. By the end of it, they end up being buds. I mean, this match didn't get a whole lot of time, but it was more or less a Riddle showcase until the finish. The other thing I talk about with Riddle's work is that generally his shit looks good. Like, he can do all the wrestling basics, but I also appreciate his ability to incorporate a lot of the MMA background into his matches. And you might think it would be a clash of styles in most instances, especially when he's out there working with some of the greener guys that don't have any mixed martial arts experience. But Riddle can also do a lot of the modern athletic stuff too, so he's sort of the best of both worlds. The angles at ringside with the Usos and Owens and Zayn getting kicked out, only for them to end up coming back out for like 5 minutes later, was so dumb. Like, we've already seen WWE do this a handful of times where the ref will eject guys from ringside, and then those same people will come out later on in the match and the ref just lets it happen. Doesn't bother throwing out the match. Doesn't bother slapping a fine on the wrestlers for disobeying orders. They're usually just like, oh shit, they're back out again. Guess it's out of my control now. So, well, that led to Riddle hitting a dive onto the Usos on the floor. And when he came back to try and hit a top rope move on Solo, He got caught with a thrust kick. And then Solo hit Riddle with the Oriental Spike for the 3 count. And once you get over the lunacy of them beating Matt Riddle when he literally just came back on TV a week ago, and they beat him in his first match back. Aside from that, I mean, the match was fine. I get the idea of them not wanting to beat Solo right now, but if the end result was going to be them beating Matt Riddle by the end of this thing, could have just gone with a DQ finish. Unless them beating Riddle was strategically done to sort of teach him a lesson after coming back from suspension. In that case, I mean, it's still retarded, but I mean, I can at least see why it was done. I don't know if it was necessary to have Solo bury Riddle under the announce table afterwards. I mean, that was more so a deliberate effort on their part to send a message to the poor fucker. But that was kind of how they closed out the show. Sikoa flipped the announce desk over onto Riddle. Owens and Zayn ran out to pull the table off of him. And the heels all stood in the ring while I wrote down in all caps in bold print, "Heat." Because we all know Vince loves that heat. Again, do I really have a desire to see a 6-man tag with these guys? I mean, it's not like I'm dreading it. I mean, I think there are way more productive ways to go about this creatively that don't resort to pinning the same cast of characters against each other again. We really should be beyond this point by now, but whatever. But that was really my main gripe with everything on last week's show. It was sort of a carryover for this week. There are a lot of WrestleMania feuds that are still going on. And while I'm not radically opposed to the idea of doing 1 or 2 rematches coming out of WrestleMania weekend, when 70 to 80% of the feuds are being continued, in certain cases where the babyfaces actually went over clean, why do we need to see the shit continue? Why is Ray still feuding with Dom after he beat him clean in the singles match? Why are Sammy and KO feuding with the Usos when they beat them clean for the belts on night 1? Why is the Judgment Day still a thing when Balor lost clean to Edge inside the Cell match? Whatever happened to the built-in expectation that WrestleMania was supposed to be the culmination point for a lot of the key storylines? I mean, I get they have to sell WrestleMania Backlash on the cock, but God, you don't need to have every fucking feud be a holdover. But this was just sort of another week where I got done watching the show and I'm like, more of the same, man. It's every interchangeable SmackDown we reviewed on the channel in the last 7 months. All these shows blend together. It's the same fucking dudes every week. The only difference is we've considerably cut back on the Bray Wyatt tangents, which has been a blessing in disguise. I mean, I'm not about to suggest this show needs more Bray Wyatt. That's the last thing this show needs. But it definitely needs some life and energy restored. Because right now, I'm having a hard time coming up with ways to entertain myself talking about this stuff. It's one thing to put on dry, dull wrestling programming where there's actual meaningful story direction with wrestlers that you actually care about. This is just a dull, lackluster wrestling show with 0 people to care about. And the one fucking guy that I want to see every week on this show, LA Knight, getting buried 6 ways from Sunday. Deliberately. And that's the thing that's so frustrating. It's intentional. What they're doing with LA Knight right now, it's ridiculous. They know the guy's a talent. They hear the crowd reaction. They know that guy is a megastar. So why are they beating him? Because he got over before they were ready. Sucks, but it's kind of the reality of the way wrestling goes these days. And if you think WWE is exclusive to that conversation, AEW falls in the same camp, man. Ricky Starks is the prime example of that. One of the hottest baby faces coming into 2023. Look where that fucking guy is now. And I gotta be honest, capping off this SmackDown show, the follow-up to Sami and Owens winning the tag belts at Mania really hasn't been all that compelling on television. And I talked about it last week. Yeah, they have the belts, but it's starting to become a textbook example of the thrill of the chase maybe being more intriguing than the actual triumph. Because they have the belts now, and it's like, okay, now what? How do you keep them interesting as the champions? Tell you what, having them continue to feud with the Usos isn't helping. I mean, it should feel like a bigger deal now that we've seen a little bit of the change in the guard with who's holding the company belts. Yet, something's still missing. I don't know what it is. It's bad creative for one, but on the other hand, maybe it's the realization that they may have fucked up by not putting the Universal title on Cody. I'm still not convinced that keeping the belt on Roman was the best choice. I mean, I've heard the arguments that Roman retaining was a good call, and far be it for me to give WWE credit, but maybe they do have a game plan. Maybe the idea is to prolong the Cody title win and build up to it after we've seen Cody go through a few more obstacles and stumbling blocks. But right now, I'm yet to see how this has paid dividends for them. Now that we've seen Cody take a pinfall. I mean, if he beats Brock at the Backlash show and then beats Roman at SummerSlam, I mean, by that point, they'd have well surpassed Roman's 1,000th day as champion. So, it's on the table. Technically, you could still do the title change at SummerSlam, but will it have as much impact as it would have if they, say, did it at WrestleMania? When people were actually frothing at the mouth to see the title switch in front of a bigger audience? Guess we'll see how he fares against Brock. I don't really know if I want to see Cody get suplexed around like a ragdoll for 10 plus minutes, but maybe Cody will find a way to sell me on it. Who knows? But all in all, I think that's all I got for this one. So you can all stop back on the Friday show to check us out. We'll be seeing what Dynamite has in store and continuing along in our retro archives. So thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Peace out.